Dear Elvis, I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this. Those were the first words Elvis Presley saw, and for a few seconds, he couldn't read the rest. The room around him was still moving. People were talking, phones were ringing, someone was laughing in another room, but Elvis heard none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the little piece of paper in his hands. Because this wasn't a normal fan letter. This wasn't someone asking for an autograph. It wasn't someone begging to meet the king of rock and roll. It was a child's voice reaching through a hospital room and asking one of the most famous men in the world for something money couldn't buy: his time. Elvis slowly read the sentence again. I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this. Then he looked at the envelope. It was small, plain white. The handwriting was uneven, almost shaky. Only 4 words were written across the front. For Elvis Presley. No famous name, no important address, no reason for Elvis to stop what he was doing, except for one thing. The letter had come from a children's hospital, and the child who wrote it had been waiting there for a long time. Waiting for doctors, waiting for medicine, waiting for answers, and, perhaps most painfully of all, waiting for tomorrow. The boy's world had become very small. There had once been school, friends, games, noise, sunlight. The ordinary things children complain about without realizing how precious they are. But now his world was measured in hospital rooms, white walls, cold floors, quiet conversations, footsteps passing his door, the sound of medical equipment during the night. He knew the nurses by the sound of their footsteps. He knew which doctor walked quickly down the hallway. He knew what time the lights were turned off. And he knew the difference between the footsteps of someone coming to check on him and the footsteps of someone carrying bad news. At night, when the hallway became quiet, the boy often stared toward the window. Beyond the glass was a world that continued without him. Cars passed, people walked, lights appeared in distant buildings. Somewhere children were laughing. Somewhere, families were eating dinner. Somewhere, life was happening, and he was still there. In the same bed, under the same ceiling, waiting. But there was one thing that could make those nights disappear: a little radio. It wasn't new, it wasn't expensive. Its plastic case had scratches across it. One of the buttons was loose. Sometimes the signal disappeared completely, but the boy didn't care, because when he turned that radio on, the hospital became smaller, and sometimes, through the static, he heard a voice he knew immediately: Elvis Presley. The boy would close his eyes, and suddenly, he wasn't in a hospital anymore. He imagined a giant stage, thousands of lights, a screaming crowd, music filling the air, and Elvis standing beneath the spotlight. The boy imagined himself somewhere in that crowd, not sick, not frightened, not waiting for another test, just a kid, free. For a few minutes, Elvis gave him something no medicine could give him: an escape. And eventually, the boy began to believe something. Maybe music could carry a person through a difficult night. Maybe a voice coming through a little radio could remind someone that tomorrow still existed. So one day, he decided to write to Elvis. He knew it was probably foolish. Why would Elvis Presley read his letter? Elvis received thousands of letters. Famous people wrote to him. Politicians knew him. Actors knew him. Musicians knew him. Millions of fans wanted his attention. What chance did one sick child have? Almost none. But the boy didn't need much. He didn't need Elvis to solve everything. He didn't need money. He didn't need fame. He didn't even need a gift. He just wanted Elvis to know that his music had reached someone. So he picked up a pen and began writing, slowly, one word at a time. Sometimes he stopped. Sometimes he crossed a sentence out. Sometimes he stared at the page because he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. How do you explain fear to someone you've never met? How do you explain what it feels like to be a child and wonder whether you'll ever walk through your own front door again? He tried. He told Elvis about the hospital. He told him about the nights. He told him about the little radio beside his bed. And then he wrote, I listen to you when I'm scared." He paused, then continued. "Your songs make me feel like tomorrow is still possible." He stared at that sentence for a long time. Then, near the bottom of the page, he wrote the words that would eventually stop Elvis Presley in his tracks. "If you ever have time," a pause, then, "could you come see me?" That was it. No demand, no expectation, just a child asking a question. The boy folded the paper, placed it inside the envelope, and handed it over. As he watched the letter disappear, he already knew what he expected. Nothing. He expected the letter to vanish into a mountain of other letters. He expected Elvis would never see it. And eventually, he forgot about it. Days passed. The boy returned to the same routine: medicine, tests, long hours, the radio. At night, he still listened to Elvis. Sometimes he wondered whether his letter had reached him. But he never seriously believed that Elvis would come. That would have been too impossible. Elvis belonged to another world, a world of giant stages, bright lights, millions of fans. The boy belonged to a hospital room. Those two worlds weren't supposed to meet. At least, that's what he believed. Then, one afternoon, the impossible happened. The letter reached Elvis Presley. It arrived among other mail. Someone placed it in front of him. At first, Elvis barely noticed it. Another envelope, another message, another name, another day. Then he saw the handwriting. For Elvis Presley. Something about it made him pick it up. He opened it. He read the first line and stopped. "Dear Elvis, I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this." Elvis looked at the page. His expression changed. He continued, slowly. Every sentence took him deeper into the child's world. He read about the hospital, the loneliness, the little radio, the nights. Then he reached the line, "Your songs make me feel like tomorrow is still possible." Elvis lowered the page. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. He simply stared at those words. Because Elvis knew what it meant to have millions of people listening to you. But this was different. This child wasn't listening because Elvis was famous. He was listening because Elvis's voice gave him something to hold on to: hope. Elvis picked up the letter again. He read the final request. "If you ever have time, could you come see me?" Silence. Someone nearby finally spoke. "It's a sweet letter." Elvis didn't answer. Another person mentioned how many letters came every day. Still nothing. Elvis folded the letter, then unfolded it. He looked at the first sentence again. "I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this." That sentence had changed everything. He looked up. His voice was quiet. "Where is that hospital?" The room went still. Someone gave him the name. Then came the practical questions. His schedule, his commitments, the people waiting for him, the plans that had already been made. But Elvis had already made his decision. He looked down at the letter, then said, "We're going." Someone hesitated. "Today?" Elvis nodded. "Today." And then he said something that explained why. "He took the time to write to me." He folded the letter carefully. "I can take the time to go to him." Miles away, the boy knew nothing. He was still in this room, still beside the little radio, still living 1 hour at a time. That afternoon, he looked toward the hallway. A nurse passed, then another. Nothing unusual. He turned back toward the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to fall. The boy reached for his radio. He turned the dial. Static. He adjusted it. More static. Then suddenly, a familiar voice. "Elvis." The boy smiled. He closed his eyes. He didn't know that Elvis was no longer just a voice coming through the radio. He didn't know that Elvis was somewhere on the road. He didn't know that the letter he had almost forgotten was now sitting inside Elvis's pocket. And he didn't know that the man he believed was impossibly far away was getting closer with every passing minute. The car finally approached the hospital. Inside, Elvis looked out the window. For a moment, he said nothing. The letter was still in his hand. He looked at it one last time, then folded it carefully. Outside, the hospital doors opened and closed. Doctors walked through the entrance. Nurses moved down the corridors. Families waited. Children slept. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Then the car stopped. Elvis stepped out. He walked toward the entrance. Inside, the boy was still listening to the radio, still unaware, still believing that his letter had probably disappeared into the world. Then, footsteps began moving down the hallway. Closer, closer, closer. The boy slowly turned his head toward the door. He expected a nurse, maybe a doctor, maybe his mother. But the footsteps stopped outside his room. The door began to open, and before the boy could understand what he was seeing, a familiar voice said, "So, you're the one who wrote me that letter." The boy looked up. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. And for several seconds, he couldn't speak. Because standing in front of him was the man he had only ever known through a little radio, Elvis Presley. And Elvis had come. The boy stared at the doorway. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. For a few seconds, his mind refused to believe what his eyes were telling him. The man standing in front of him wasn't on a television screen. He wasn't a photograph. He wasn't a voice coming through the little radio beside his bed. He was standing there, inside the hospital, looking directly at him. Elvis Presley. Elvis took one slow step into the room, then another. He smiled. Not the enormous stage smile the boy had seen in photographs. Something quieter, something warmer. He looked at the child and said, "So, you're the one who wrote me that letter?" The boy swallowed. He nodded. That was all he could manage. Elvis glanced at the small radio beside the bed, then back at the boy. "I've been wanting to meet you." The boy's eyes immediately filled with tears. "I didn't think you'd come." Elvis pulled a chair closer. He sat down, then leaned forward. "You asked me to come." A short pause. "So I came." The boy looked down. A tear fell onto the hospital blanket. He quickly wiped it away, almost embarrassed. Elvis noticed, but he didn't make a big deal of it. Instead, he looked around the room. The white walls, the medical equipment, the window, the little radio. Then he looked back at the boy. "How long have you been here?" The boy answered quietly, "A long time." Elvis nodded. "I figured." The boy looked at him. "How did you find my letter?" Elvis smiled. "It found me." The boy didn't understand. Elvis laughed softly. "Well, somebody gave it to me." The boy smiled for the first time. Then Elvis pointed toward the radio. "That the radio you were talking about?" The boy nodded. "I listen to you every night." Elvis raised his eyebrows. "Every night?" "Almost." "Almost." The boy smiled. "Sometimes the signal disappears." Elvis laughed. "Then we've got to fix that." The boy laughed too. And just like that, the room changed. For the first time, it didn't feel like a hospital room. It felt like two people talking, one famous, one unknown, but neither of them seemed to care about the difference. Elvis stayed beside the bed. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't ask how long the visit was supposed to last. He didn't seem interested in leaving. He asked the boy questions. What did he like? What music did he listen to? What did he want to do when he got better? The boy hesitated at first, then he started talking. He wanted to go outside. He wanted to run. He wanted to go home. He wanted to see his friends. He wanted to do ordinary things again. Elvis listened. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he simply remained quiet. The boy eventually asked, "Do you ever get scared?" The question caught Elvis off guard. He looked at the boy. "Scared?" The boy nodded. Elvis thought for a moment. "Sure." The boy looked surprised. "You do?" Elvis smiled. "Everybody does." The boy looked down at his hands. "I get scared a lot." Elvis didn't try to tell him not to be. He didn't say everything would magically be okay. Instead, he said, "Being scared doesn't mean you're weak." The boy looked up. It means you're human." The words stayed between them, and for the boy, they meant something. Because so many adults had been telling him to be brave, be strong, don't worry, everything will be fine. But Elvis didn't tell him to stop being afraid. He simply told him that fear didn't make him less courageous. Maybe that was exactly what the boy needed to hear. A few minutes later, the boy noticed something. Elvis was still holding the letter, the same letter, the one he had written with shaky hands, the one he had almost forgotten. The boy pointed toward it. "You still have it?" Elvis looked down. "Of course." The boy smiled. "Why?" Elvis looked at him. "Because somebody wrote it." He folded it carefully, then placed it safely in his pocket. The boy watched him. He seemed surprised that something so small could matter to someone as famous as Elvis. Then Elvis said, "You know what I liked about your letter?" The boy shook his head. "You didn't ask me for anything." The boy smiled. "I just wanted you to come." Elvis nodded. "I know." And then came a sentence the boy would never forget. Sometimes that's the most important thing you can ask for. Outside the room, word was spreading. A nurse whispered to another nurse. A parent looked down the hallway. Someone quietly said the name, Elvis. Within minutes, the atmosphere of the children's ward had changed. Children began asking questions. "Is he really here? Can I see him? Is that Elvis Presley?" Some children were too sick to leave their beds. Others were sitting in wheelchairs. Some were being held by their parents. And one by one, Elvis began visiting them. He didn't rush past. He stopped. He talked. He smiled. He shook hands. He listened. One little boy stared at him with enormous eyes. Elvis leaned closer. "You know who I am?" The child nodded. Elvis looked serious. "Good." The boy waited. Then Elvis added, "Because I was about to introduce myself." The child laughed. His mother laughed too. And suddenly, the hallway was filled with something that hospitals don't often get enough of: laughter. Elvis moved from room to room. For a few minutes, every child became more than a patient. They became fans. They became kids again. And the boy who had written the letter watched from his doorway. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had asked Elvis to come for him, but Elvis had come for everyone. Eventually, Elvis returned to the boy's room. The boy smiled. "You met everybody." Elvis nodded. "Almost." The boy looked confused. "Who did you miss?" Elvis pointed toward him. "You." The boy laughed. "I've been here the whole time." "I know." Elvis sat down again. The room became quiet. Then the boy asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since Elvis arrived. "Will you sing?" Elvis looked at him. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he smiled. "You want me to sing?" The boy nodded. Elvis looked around the room. There was no stage, no microphone, no orchestra, no spotlight, only hospital walls. A few nurses outside the door, children watching from nearby rooms, parents standing silently in the hallway. Elvis smiled. "All right." He stood. The hallway slowly became quiet. People gathered. A nurse stopped what she was doing. A doctor stepped out of a nearby room. Children turned toward the sound. And then Elvis began to sing. His voice moved through the hallway, soft at first, then stronger. The same voice that had once shaken concert halls was now filling a hospital corridor. But something about this performance was different. There were no screaming fans, no flashing cameras, no giant stage, no applause between verses, just children listening. One little girl held her mother's hand. A boy in a wheelchair smiled. A nurse covered her mouth. One father turned away because his eyes had filled with tears. And the child who had written the letter closed his eyes. For a few moments, he forgot everything. The hospital disappeared. The fear disappeared. The uncertainty disappeared. There was only the music and Elvis. When the song ended, nobody moved. Silence. A long silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone knows they have just witnessed something they will remember. Then the first child began clapping. Another followed, then another. Soon the hallway filled with applause. Elvis smiled, but he didn't take a bow. He simply looked at the children, because this wasn't about him. He walked back toward the boy. The boy opened his eyes. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. Elvis sat beside him again. "You okay?" The boy nodded. "That was the best day ever." Elvis smiled. "I've had a few good days myself." The boy laughed. Then he looked serious again. "I thought you were too famous to come." Elvis looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Nobody is too famous to make time for someone who needs a friend." The boy stared at him. That sentence hit differently, because the boy had spent so long believing he was forgotten. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe his voice mattered. Maybe someone really could hear him. Elvis eventually had to leave. The visit couldn't last forever. But before he stood, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small keepsake. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that belonged in a museum. Just something personal. He placed it in the boy's hand. The boy looked down. "For me?" Elvis nodded. "For you." The boy held it carefully. Then he asked, "Why?" Elvis smiled. "So you'll remember today." The boy looked at him. "I won't forget." Elvis nodded. "I know." He stood, walked toward the door, then stopped. He turned around. The boy was still watching him. Elvis pointed toward the radio. "Keep listening." The boy smiled. "I will." Elvis raised his hand. "Good." Then he walked away. The hallway slowly became quiet again. The children returned to their rooms. The nurses went back to work. The doctors continued their rounds, and Elvis walked toward the hospital entrance. But before he stepped outside, he stopped. He looked back down the corridor. For a moment, he could still hear the children's laughter. He could still see the boy's face. And he could still remember the words from the letter. "Your songs make me feel like tomorrow is still possible." Elvis reached into his pocket. The letter was still there. He touched it, then quietly walked outside. The car was waiting. He got inside. The door closed. The car pulled away. The hospital became smaller behind him, but inside one room, the little radio was still playing. The boy reached toward it, turned the dial. Static. Then Elvis's voice. This time the boy smiled immediately, because now he knew the man behind the voice. He had seen him. He had spoken to him. He had shaken his hand. And Elvis had come when he asked. But the boy didn't know something yet. The visit wasn't simply going to become a memory. It was about to become something much bigger. Because one simple letter had done something nobody expected. It had brought a superstar into a hospital. It had made frightened children laugh. It had given exhausted parents a reason to smile. And it had reminded one little boy of something he had almost forgotten. Tomorrow was still possible. But the most important part of the story was still waiting to happen. Because after Elvis left the hospital, the boy looked down at the letter he had written, and beside it was the little radio. He slowly smiled, then whispered something so quietly that only his mother heard it. "He really came." And those 4 words would become the memory he carried with him. Long after the sound of Elvis's footsteps had disappeared down the hallway. The car carrying Elvis Presley was already several blocks away. The hospital was disappearing behind him. The noise of the city slowly swallowed the sound of the engine. But Elvis wasn't talking. He was sitting quietly, looking out the window. In his hand was the little letter. The same letter that had begun with a sentence no child should ever have to write. "Dear Elvis, I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this." Elvis had read those words before, but now they felt different, because they had a face, a voice, a smile. A little boy who had looked at him as though the impossible had suddenly become real. Elvis folded the letter carefully. He didn't throw it away. He didn't hand it back. He kept it. And for a long time he said nothing, Because sometimes a person can walk into a room thinking they're there to give someone hope, and leave realizing that the other person gave them something too. Back inside the hospital, the hallway had become quiet again. The children had returned to their rooms. The nurses were back at work. The doctors continued moving from one room to another. The world had returned to normal. Almost. The boy remained in his bed. His mother sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The boy was staring at the doorway where Elvis had disappeared. His mother finally asked, "Are you happy?" The boy nodded. Then he smiled. A real smile. Not the kind he had been giving people to make them feel better. Not the kind children sometimes give their parents when they know their parents are scared. This smile was different. It came from somewhere deeper. He looked toward the little radio, then whispered, "He really came." His mother squeezed his hand. "I know." The boy shook his head. "No." He looked at her. "He really came." As if saying it twice could make the memory more real. As if some part of him still couldn't believe it. His mother smiled through tears. "Yes, he really came." That night, the hospital lights became dim. The hallway grew quiet. One by one, the doors closed. The sound of footsteps became less frequent. And once again, the boy was alone with his little radio. He reached for it. His fingers moved slowly across the buttons. Click, static. He adjusted the dial. More static. Then suddenly, music. The familiar voice filled the room. Elvis. The boy smiled. But something was different now. Before that day, Elvis had been a voice, a distant figure, someone who lived in another world, someone the boy knew through a radio. Now, when the voice came through the speaker, he could picture the person behind it. He could picture Elvis sitting beside his bed. He could remember the way he smiled, the way he listened, the way he said, "You asked me to come. Then, so I came." The boy closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the silence, because he had a memory to fill it. But the visit had changed more than one child. Down the hallway, nurses were still talking about it. One nurse remembered the little boy's face when Elvis entered. Another remembered the laughter. A doctor remembered how quickly the atmosphere changed. Parents remembered their children smiling. And the children? They remembered something even simpler. For one afternoon, someone famous had walked into their world instead of asking them to enter his. That mattered. Because hospitals can make children feel as though the whole world is moving forward without them. But that day, the outside world had come inside. Music had come inside. Laughter had come inside. And hope had come inside. The next morning, something unexpected happened. The boy woke up earlier than usual. His mother was surprised. "You're awake already?" He nodded. He looked toward the window. The morning light was coming through. He watched it for several seconds. Then he said, "I want to go outside." His mother smiled. "We'll see." The boy looked at her. "No, I mean someday. I want to go outside." His mother understood. She reached for his hand. "You will." The boy looked toward the radio, then smiled. "I'm going to." Maybe it was only a few words. Maybe nothing had changed medically in that single moment. But something inside the boy had changed. He had stopped thinking only about what he was losing. He had started thinking about what he wanted to return to. The world outside, his friends, his home, the sunlight, tomorrow. And somewhere else, Elvis continued with his life. The world didn't stop because of one hospital visit. There were still performances. There were still schedules. There were still crowds. There were still people waiting to see him. Everywhere he went, people called his name. Cameras followed him. Fans reached for him. The world saw the superstar. But inside Elvis's memory was a much quieter image. A little boy, a hospital bed, a scratched radio, and a handwritten letter. That image stayed with him, because the boy had reminded him of something fame could easily make a person forget. The size of your audience doesn't determine the size of your impact. Sometimes millions of people can hear you, and one person can truly listen. Sometimes thousands can applaud, while one quiet voice can change you. And that little voice had belonged to a child who simply wanted someone to come. There is something almost haunting about the letter. The boy could have asked for anything. He could have asked Elvis for money, a gift, a photograph, a television, a chance to meet him on a stage. But he didn't. He asked for something much more difficult. He asked for time. Because when someone is frightened, the most valuable thing another person can give them isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's presence. Sometimes it's sitting beside them. Sometimes it's listening. Sometimes it's saying, "I'm here." And that was what Elvis gave him. The boy kept the memory. He kept the little keepsake Elvis had left with him. He kept the radio, and most importantly, he kept the letter. The letter that had once felt like a desperate message became something else. Proof. Proof that his voice could travel. Proof that someone could hear him. Proof that being small didn't mean being invisible. He had written to the biggest star he could think of, and the biggest star he knew had answered. Not with another letter, not with a photograph, but by walking through the door. Imagine that moment from the boy's perspective. The door opens. You expect another nurse. Instead, the person you've listened to every night is standing there. You look at him. He looks at you. And suddenly, the world feels different. For years, the boy had been lying in that bed waiting for something. Waiting for good news. Waiting to leave. Waiting to feel normal. Waiting for tomorrow. Then one afternoon, tomorrow seemed to arrive early. It arrived wearing a dark suit. It arrived with a familiar smile. It arrived carrying no miracle medicine, no magical cure, just time. And sometimes, time is exactly what a frightened person needs. The story could have ended there. Elvis came, he sang, the children smiled, he left. But the real ending wasn't what happened while Elvis was inside the hospital. It was what happened after he left. Because the boy had been given something he could carry forward, a memory, a reason to believe, a reminder that the world could still surprise him. And whenever fear returned, he could remember that afternoon. Whenever the hospital felt too cold, he could remember the laughter. Whenever tomorrow seemed impossible, he could remember Elvis's voice. "You asked me to come, so I came." Years can pass, people can change, memories can become softer around the edges. But some moments refuse to disappear. They stay exactly where they were created. A hallway, a hospital room, a little radio, a child, and a man who decided that, for one afternoon, nothing else was more important. That is why the story isn't really about Elvis Presley. Not entirely. It's about the distance between two people who should never have met. A world-famous entertainer and a child in a hospital bed. One had millions of people listening to him. The other was afraid nobody would hear him. And somehow, they found each other, through a letter. The boy's mother would remember that day too. She would remember the moment Elvis entered, the look on her child's face, the sound of the hallway filling with music, the laughter, the tears, and the moment after Elvis left, when her child looked toward the door and whispered, "He really came." For a parent, there are moments when you realize you can't protect your child from everything. You can't remove every fear. You can't answer every question. You can't control tomorrow. But sometimes someone else gives your child a memory powerful enough to carry them through the uncertainty. That day, Elvis gave that boy such a memory. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside the letter. We often imagine that extraordinary people change lives through extraordinary actions, but sometimes the action itself is incredibly ordinary. Someone writes, someone reads, someone listens, someone shows up. That's it. No grand speech, no impossible promise, no miracle. Just one human being telling another, "You matter enough for me to come." The little radio remained beside the boy's bed, and on another quiet night, he turned it on. Static, then music, then Elvis's voice. The boy smiled. His mother looked over. "You still love that radio?" The boy nodded. "Yeah." "Why?" He looked at the radio for a moment, then answered, "Because that's how I met him." His mother smiled, and the room became quiet again. The music continued. Outside the window, the world kept moving. Cars passed, lights appeared, people went home. Tomorrow was coming, and this time, the boy wasn't afraid of it. Maybe that's what Elvis gave him that day. Not a cure, not an escape from everything, something smaller and perhaps more important. A reason to believe that tomorrow could still contain something unexpected. A reason to keep listening. A reason to keep hoping. A reason to keep waiting for the next morning. Because the child who once wrote, "I don't know if I'll still be here when you read this," had discovered something he didn't expect. His letter had been read, his voice had been heard, and someone had come. The world would remember Elvis Presley for his music, for his voice, for the stages, for the crowds, for the records, for the fame. But somewhere in the memory of one hospital room, he was remembered differently. Not as the king, not as the superstar, not as the man millions screamed for, but simply as Elvis. The man who sat beside a frightened child, the man who listened, the man who sang in a hospital hallway, the man who could have ignored one small letter, but didn't. And maybe that's the part worth remembering. Because when the whole world was listening to Elvis, Elvis stopped and listened to one child. And that child had asked for only one thing, for someone to come. So Elvis came. And for one unforgettable afternoon, the cold walls of a children's hospital didn't feel quite so cold. The little radio didn't sound quite so distant. And tomorrow didn't seem quite so frightening. Because sometimes, you don't have to save someone's entire world. Sometimes, you just have to walk through the door. And sometimes, one small act of kindness becomes the memory that keeps someone believing in tomorrow.